processes. In addition to that, I'm also a visiting scholar at the Future Forum, which is a think tank based in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, where we kind of how do we actually address these issues going forward, given new realities of our times. And also, I'm part of the executive committee of the Barbados China French Association, which again try to promote these deep linkages between Barbados in the Caribbean in general, but Barbados in particular, and Asia in general, but again China in particular. And I'll be discussing today what I think is a very, let's say, a small topic, in the sense that there are a lot of fallacies regarding how internet economics works and what it actually supposed to produce. When you actually look at the numbers, you have to really take it much more cautiously and think from actually some data now, so you can realize, well, we actually really do have our work cut out, but that's actually a good thing if you call it a good thing about our current predicament. I can share my screen to begin the presentation. Ooh. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the progress and challenges of digital economies in the new normal. And it's very important we say new normal, because a lot of times it's like almost a conversation with, well, how do we go back to before the pandemic? Well, there's no going back. This is our new current situation. I think from the time we take that assumption away, we can have a much more stabilized conversation. So one of the important things to keep in mind is always look at what does the actual data show us about our current situation regarding to markets, regarding to economics, of course, regarding to the tech terms, and by default, digital economics. So FANG here, or FANG M, is Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft, the very big tech firms in the US in this slide. One of the things that people, I think, take for granted is that, yes, there was, for example, some issues with the US capital markets in the early months of this year. But then as the markets recovered by primarily from Fed injections of money supply, there was obviously a stabilization, actually growth of the capital markets in the US. When you kind of take it back a bit, you realize that a lot of the actual stabilization growth came from tech firms. And it came from these very specific tech firms, which we mostly called FANG M or something else FANG. And it's a huge gap. So 503% growth in market cap. Just over this 2013, 2020, and you see in the last blip there in 2020, it's been a skyrocket increase in value. This is primarily driven by obviously the Fed capital injection, and it's actually been driving almost the entire markets. People don't realize that a lot of the actual market indices are not actually weighted. So when you see that really big growth, the actual market isn't growing. There's very specific companies in the market that's growing. So this is a thing to take in consideration when we're actually moving forward in the conversation. So one of the other things that is often, not always, but often overlooked is that internet usage is, of course, not uniform around the world, but the extent to which people are actually not on the internet is actually something often very shocking. So you see from this chart here, and you look at Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, huge amounts of populations are actually not even online yet into 2020. So for example, in China, 41% of China is actually not online. So all this growth and so forth from that has come through in these last 4 decades since reform and open up in China, even they have barely half the actual population online. Obviously, South Asia is where a big bucket of growth still has to come from. And if you look at the Caribbean actually fairly well, not a very large population. So a lot of the actual unconnected population is primarily like things like Haiti, Dominican Republic, so forth. So and Cuba as well. But Southeast Asia, East Asia, Asia in general, has a huge well of growth. If you look at North America, even if, for example, all of North America comes online now, at best, at most, is 44 million coming on, which is compared to many billions. Is also, can't really compare. So when you think about future growth in terms of digital economies, you gotta look actually at Asia. That's where the bulk of growth is coming. Even, for example, when you look at general GDP trends on a world stage, most of the actual world growth in GDP comes from one particular region, that's Southeast Asia. So just to solidify the idea of it, what happens online right now, although I said, for example, like we still have a lot of growth to come in our current online markets. In its chart kind of shows you what happens in 60 seconds online. Well, 3.5 million searches happen every minute. 87,000 tweets happen every minute. 4.5 million videos are viewed on YouTube every minute. This is a situation where the internet is not just, let's say, a aspect of the economy. In some sense, for many people's lives, the internet is like the baseline, the axiomatic structure of the economy itself. You spend all this time online, and you would think, for example, all this time online would translate, I would think, to translate to actual much more economic growth. But it's actually a problem. Only 4% of the world's GDP comes from internet commerce, which I think intuitively, people might find a bit shocking. But then when you kind of peel back the onion a bit, you realize that, well, not many people are online yet. Even when you were online, the actual, let's say, things that contribute to GDP aren't necessarily, for example, buying some clocks on Taobao or some books on Amazon, but some much more bigger expenditures. But even then, it kind of seems like 4% still seems like a very, very small amount. But that's actually true. There are actually companies, for example, if you know about Stripe in the US, the payments company, their entire raison d'etre for existing is how do we increase the GDP of the internet? But that's all kind of like a shorthand way of saying how do we make more commerce actually happen online? Or another saying that how do we actually unlock commerce, given that the internet has a much greater reach of doing business than, for example, let's say a mom and pop shop on Broad Street. So this is kind of the reality where we think about the internet as changing everything. And obviously for many people, it has. But then when you look at the actual, let's say, real impact of the internet, it hasn't actually made that much a big change in actual growth reality metrics. That's why I mentioned earlier, the very first slide, even in capital markets, the S&P in America, obviously the biggest market and most important market to analyze, a big chunk of that growth is actually from a very small number of companies. And these small number of companies, again, the FANG-M, they have this very particular business model where Facebook, for example, 98% of revenue comes from selling ads only online from companies who, sell actual goods. Or Google, which obviously is a very big transformation, but again, 75% revenue comes from selling ads from companies. So you have to keep that in consideration and think about how do we actually move forward? How do we actually think about growing the digital economy when the actual, let's say, if you want to say a very snarky way, the economy itself is actually almost stagnant. So moving forward, this same idea, one of the things that people kind of talk about digital economy is stock valuation. So I think it's not a very good baseline metric, but it's still telling in some sense. So GGV Capital, which is like a very, very famous VC firm based in Asia, first in China, now they expand to Southeast Asia and South Asia. They have this index where if you invested $100 in X company in January, how much money would you make? This is goes to July. So if you invested, for example, $100 in Livongo in January, in July you have like $398 return already. Livongo, by the way, is like a health data company. Or even Amazon, for example, or you see the whole list there. So although it's extreme like explosion or growth in online activity, the online activity isn't actually translating into generalized economic growth. So one, for example, one of the common ideas is this. You see, for example, Apple. Apple is, let's say, Apple is easily the most viable company, at least in America. In the world, probably is, except if Saudi Aramco. It's a bit complicated. But let's say Apple is the most viable company ever in human history. Apple, however, let's say hires, let's say maybe a tenth of what General Motors did at peak. So although the value is very, very high, although the actual impact is very, very high, when you try to translate that into real economy metrics, generalized income growth across the economy, the actual company itself, although it's an extremely amazing company, doesn't actually translate that much into the real world. That's a problem that we have to kind of think about going forward as well. So I know this is kind of not a very easy graph to read, actually, but you can see that actually the farm, not maybe substance, but the farm is quite clear. That huge line that goes up there in the light green is food delivery growth, where you see during the pandemic, some industries did well, but some industries did amazingly well. Also, food delivery across the board globally, but also China, North America, has explosion, is the correct word to use here. But again, food delivery as an online company, like let's say Uber Eats. Uber Eats relies on real life companies, as in, restaurants and open kitchens and so forth, actually make the food and grow. But yeah, so in some sense, you can say, well, okay, food delivery companies are helping these real economies to grow. But the rate at which, for example, let's say Uber Eats is growing or grew, completely outstrips, for example, how the rate of actual, let's say, restaurant growth is in America. So there's still some disconnect in the when of valuation and growth and actual real like economic progress. But we'll kind of go into that a bit further. So I mentioned the whole explosion idea. So there are some industries during the pandemic issue, now in the new normal, that completely exploded. Also, online video chatting, if you're going right now, food delivery, social media, online shopping, healthcare, so forth. But there's still a problem. How do you translate this new growth in the new normal into actual, let's say, tangible growth? And this kind of goes back to a very old quote by Robert Solow, who in 1987 he made a statement where you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And by that, he meant that although these things in the computer, they're becoming so ubiquitous, why is it that the actual return from, let's say, computer age, we call it information age now, ICT, hasn't actually impacted these industries that as much as we think it would? Now, obviously, back in 1987, it was like a snarky comment, right? But as it turns out, ironically enough, you don't actually see the productivity impact from digital economies or digital firms or digital native firms into actual generalized real growth. But we're kind of starting to see a new difference now. This is one of my favorite charts of the year. Zoom has surpassed in valuation the combined value of the top 7 airlines in the US, or in the world, pretty much. And that's a big like market structural change, right? And you're trying to see a thing where how is it that how is it that online has only now having this big impact, or does it actually now start have big impact? Before we had all these before, but in some cases they weren't unlocked. They weren't quite unlocked yet. But now you're seeing this massive economic shift where you can, almost in some sense are able, you're primed to now unlock the actual digital native firms. So one good example that to use is kind of what economists say all the time. Why is it, for example, that when electricity was invented, you didn't actually see much growth that happened in generalized markets from electricity? It took a long time. Well, the reason it took a long time, not because people didn't think, oh well, it's not that much more useful than steam power or whatever. It was understood factually or objectively to be a very big improvement. But it still took decades for the actual electricity invention to actually normalize itself into productivity, actual real growth in the economy. A lot of that's actually because how, for example, let's say a factory was constructed pre electric age. It was designed in a way to accommodate, for example, steam power. You have very tall factories, have like a steam mill in the center, so you kind of have a much more idea, a much more utility steam power because it's much more homogenized. With electricity now, we have the we can actually flatten the factory and expand it more horizontally and actually change the actual layout and so forth. So the reason why you can't actually have a big increase in productivity from as fundamental as significant as electricity because the actual market itself was not structured in a way to actually accept it. So over time, when factories got redesigned and people got retrained, and so we kind of really see the uptick now in productivity that came from the actual electricity, which is a decades long lag. All the, let's say, the information age, let's say, is at best from the year 2000. So we're 2 decades in. So it's not too surprising, I think, why you don't see these factors kind of multiplying now. This is a very well-known study about method regression, meaning they looked at many studies to actually analyze, for example, how the actual productivity in ICT is actually developing across the industries. And they found that it's not that much productivity increase that comes from ICT and digital economies. But kind of going back to what I said with the structure of the market, we're now seeing a way where the companies and markets are now almost like orchestrating themselves around ICT now. So I think for the first time in 20 years, since the actual information age, digital economy age actually started going, we're now at the precipice where the explosion in all these online firms is actually going to be met with the explosion, actual corporate reorganization. You have the remote work going now. You actually have real material utilization of online conferencing. You have a real material utilization of online tools. You're really now stepping into a new world, in a new normal, where the structure of the markets are going to actually transform the productivity of the entire world. And also, this is happening at a time where the actual growth, for example, in Southeast Asian online markets and the growth in China, growth in India, growth in Pakistan, growth in East Africa are now kind of speed up as well. So in some sense, it's almost like the pandemic has given us like a crystal, like a gift, right? Obviously there's a lot of damage and so forth going on because of the epidemic, but in some sense now is almost the kick that the world economy needed to kind of get past the complacency and actually fundamentally redesign its operations from ground up. And into the Caribbean has, kind of lagged also along with how markets have changed. But now also because of this, let's say, global reorganization, I think Caribbean firms now also is actually not lagging. They're can be at the forefront as well. So I'm optimistic at the progress of these economies, even though I think you still have to take seriously the almost negligible impact it has had over generalized income trends, generalized GDP growth, and generalized productivity data. I think it's actually now, given the pandemic in the new normal, that we actually can move forward very fast. And that's the end of my presentation. Of course, I'm very happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you so much, Rasheed. Very insightful presentation from you, and we thank you so much for that. Well, interesting on that particular statement. You can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, you'd think that we are living in the computer age, and this pandemic has essentially proven the fact that we can still continue doing business with the use of technology, something that they did not have 100 years ago. Um, Whether it will actually be effective as the world enters into global recession is an entirely different story altogether. So we are going to look at closely at the increasing businesses in the digital economy in the days and months that are happening as we move forward in the pandemic. So thank you so much for that. Next in our program, I'm just gonna just share it for everybody, for our viewers, and just to keep track of things. Let me see if I can share my screen. I think I am sharing my screen. Oh, nonetheless. Uh, yes, there you go. So we have up next, our next speaker is a barrister and academic, editor of the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs. Dr. Venkat is also a member of our advisory council. So before you begin, Dr. Venkat, you'd like to hopefully get a sort of some profile before you start your statement or your presentation. So without further ado, let's all welcome Dr. Venkat Iyer.
Thank you, Matthew. And in keeping with your request, maybe I should just say a few words about myself. I live in Northern Ireland, and as Matthew has pointed out, I'm a lawyer, what in British terms would be called a barrister. I also am attached to the University of Ulster, which is one of two universities in Northern Ireland, where I teach commercial law, media law, and a host of other topics. In terms of my specialization in practice, in legal practice, I am essentially a media law lawyer, although I do a lot of commercial work as well. I also am very interested in arbitration and latterly in mediation. So that's as far as my professional activities are concerned. And Matthew did refer to the journal that I edit. Actually, there are two journals. One of them is the one that Matthew referred to, which is the Roundtable, the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs, which I'm told is the oldest journal of its kind in the world. Although I hasten to add that I've not been editor for as long as the journal has been alive. The other journal that I edit is called the Commonwealth Lawyer, and that is a publication of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, on whose council I sit as a member. So I can claim reasonable familiarity with the Commonwealth. I also have been involved in law reform. So I was for many years Law Commissioner for Northern Ireland, which is a public office. And I do a lot of judicial training in various parts of the world, as well as media advisory work. So that roughly is my background. I don't think I should waste any more of your time giving a biographical sketch, but that's where I am. Now, having done that, I want to also, as more than a formality, thank Matthew and also Abigail, who is not here today, for the organization of this event and for inviting me to participate. I must confess, I am very new to your organization, as I'm sure you can tell. And I also have to admit that I feel a little bit like an imposter or a gatecrasher because I cannot claim any expertise either on the Caribbean or on the economy, as was the topic assigned to me earlier. I see that in the latest version of the program, it has slightly been modified. But in any case, even the modified topic is not exactly one in which I can claim any great expertise. Although I was quite pleased actually that Rashid has done an excellent job in terms of talking about the economy. So in that sense, my task is superfluous. I do have slightly more familiarity with ASEAN because I visit that region very frequently. Um, Even there are a couple of countries to which I don't go, or at least don't go frequently, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. But certainly the other parts of ASEAN, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, these are countries, again, it's no coincidence, they're all Commonwealth countries. I'm quite familiar with. I go there quite often. I've also a lot of interest in Burma. Now, this is a country about which not much is spoken for understandable reasons, but it occurred to me that if there is any interest on the part of your council to develop any initiative there, then I'll be more than happy to help, particularly in areas of commercial law or good governance. Um, and also, of course, I am quite happy to publicize any of the initiatives through my journals, as long as we find a suitable format to do that. I might mention incidentally that Matthew and Alicia, one of your other council members, are both already working on a special issue of the Roundtable on the relations between the Caribbean and ASEAN. And that I hope will also give some boost to the work that your council is doing. Now, quite clearly, my focus is largely the law. And as you can see, there are many countries, particularly in the Caribbean, where we have the common law system, with the exception, I think, of Guyana and St. Lucia. And of course, we have three, possibly four ASEAN countries. And one of the questions that I'm interested in is, can the Commonwealth become a counterweight, for example, to the growing Chinese influence and ambitions in both regions? Now, of course, the US has traditionally been seen as quite influential in the Caribbean, but it's also been described sometimes as being too democratic. The Caribbean has been described as being too democratic and not poor enough to merit sustained US government attention. So perhaps it is right for Caribbean countries to seek help and cooperation from ASEAN, which of course is one of the most dynamic regions of the world. And I suspect that will be one of the rationales for your council's work. The other aspect which I thought I'll just mention is about China's own interest in the Caribbean, and whether it's possible to explore that angle as part of your council's work. Good governance is another topic which I thought would be relevant, and I'm conscious of the fact that there have been quite a few elections recently, including the rather contentious election in Guyana, or at least the contentious after effects of the election in Guyana. And I gather there are a few more coming up in the not too distant future. And again, there the Commonwealth, as you know, has played a role in terms of election monitoring, etc. And my journals as well take some interest in this area. If you look at ASEAN, Singapore has just had a rather interesting election. And so, again, it's something which might be worth talking about doing something on. And Burma is going to have a rather important election quite soon. So those are the sort of things that I thought I should mention. As I said, I'm not here to give a substantive talk on any topic, and I do apologize for that. But it does seem to me to be probably useful for us to think about a few issues and then maybe bring it up in the ensuing discussion. I noticed actually that in the revised program, my name has been put up against COVID-19. And that again, I thought was a matter which can usefully be raised or discussed. And also the issue of how do you deal with the economic recession, which will follow the end of COVID-19, if that end comes at any time. Um, um, as for governance issues, one of the things that I presume your consular noted is that there's a lot of concern, even in countries like Singapore, which otherwise is very self-confident about the influence of China. And some of you may have read articles by Singaporean commentators, particularly a man called Bilahari Kausikan, which deals with this aspect. And there again, there is I think, a commonality with, as I was saying earlier, some concern raised in relation to the Caribbean as well. The rule of law, to my mind, is very important more broadly, and so is strengthening media freedom. So if you look, for example, at some of the league tables on media freedom, you will notice that there are some significant concerns, both about the Caribbean, although, of course, it has to be added that the concerns in the Caribbean are more focused on Mexico rather than on the southern Caribbean. But also, if you look at ASEAN, the International Press Institute often talks about the Philippines being the most dangerous country in Asia for journalists, etc. Now, obviously, one has to take these things with a pinch of salt sometimes, but it is still a topic which I think is worth keeping in mind and discussing. Other areas I think of potential cooperation would be quite familiar to you already. So you'd have disaster risk management, the issues concerning ICT, public administration, urban planning, civil aviation, trade, investment promotion, tourism, sustainable development, etc. Now, in relation to the UK itself, as you probably know, there are two important developments. The first, of course, is that the UK has recently applied to become a dialogue partner of ASEAN, and that has the potential for increasing cooperation and collaboration between the UK and ASEAN. And of course, there is the elephant in the room, which is Brexit. So my feeling is that the inevitable opening up of Britain's economy for trade and other relations with the wider world after Brexit is completely done, about which, of course, there is still some uncertainty, I think that again would give a boost to further cooperation. And those are the sort of things which I thought I'll mention. As I said, all I'm doing is giving some of my thoughts rather than giving a lecture on any of these issues. I don't know if there's much else that I need to add at this stage, but I'm more than happy as the discussion progresses to be able to answer any questions that you might have. So, Matthew, if you don't mind, maybe I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Venkat. Very insightful. Yes, so many things that you said are very buried in my thoughts. One of the things that one of the reasons why we invited you was exactly why what you mentioned. We wanted a specific perspective from an outsider, not somebody from the Caribbean, not specifically from Southeast Asia, somebody that would be looking that has experience in both regions, but not necessarily in both regions. You know what I'm saying? So, and then thank you so much for that insight. And very interesting that you mentioned about the elections in both the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, especially in the Caribbean, where you have many countries right now talking about the future of the region, and of course the very controversial Guyanese election recently. Um, a major country that will be that just had its election is Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure Dr. Driver will be talking about well, maybe briefly about that. We can hear that from him, and specifically Singapore. You also mentioned, so it's going to be something. That is, all of these elections that are happening or will happen in the future will have a greater effect in the relationship between the Caribbean and Southeast Asia and in the countries themselves throughout the region, as as everyone focuses on post-pandemic or during the pandemic and the recession that will follow. So I would like to segue to our next speaker. Uh, Let me just try to open up my. There you go, my screen, and we have Consul Philippe May, who is the Honorary Consul for Saint Vincent and Grenadines in Singapore. I'm sorry, I'm missing one letter there, and who is also the Managing Director and Head of Asia Pacific for Arton Capital. Now, Arton Capital is engaged in citizenship by investment, residency by investment, and wealth by investment, in other wealth-related matters. And interestingly, Consul May has been a resident of Singapore for at least, if not, please correct me if I'm wrong, at least 10 years. So he has been quite engaged in Singapore and ASEAN for quite some time. So has a very unique perspective. He is somebody who is not from both regions, whether ASEAN or Caribbean, but he is in both regions again, engaged in business in both. So without further ado, let me just close my screen and pass on the mic to Consul Philippe May. So Consul May, please introduce yourself as well as a little background on who you are and what you do. Thank you.
Good evening or good morning to everybody from Singapore, from the Consulate of St. Vincent and the Grenadines here at the Raffles Place in the very heart of the CBD of Singapore. I'm glad to be here and to join the roundtable discussion and give some perspective from both sides, from the ASEAN side and from the Caribbean side. Myself, as His Excellency Dr. Matthew Ingston mentioned, I have been a resident of Singapore for 15 years. I became a citizen here 12 years ago. It was fast back at that time, and nowadays it takes a bit longer. And I was appointed the Honorary Consul of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to Singapore in 2011. In 2015, after a career in wealth management and banking, I opened the Singapore office for Arton Capital, which is a global leader in residence and citizenship planning. And I oversee ASEAN and the rest of the Asia Pacific for our operations, which is both advisory of government entities as well as high net worth individuals, mostly from this region, but also from the Middle East, from Russia, the former Soviet Union, and increasingly from Africa as well. Now, what have we observed during this crisis, during this pandemic in our industry, or in the industries which are most relevant to not only St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but to the wider Eastern Caribbean region? One is, of course, tourism. Tourism is down. Nobody travels, or almost nobody. Now it restarted a bit with travelers from the US, from Canada, who are allowed to go to the islands. But it's not as usual. It's not as it was before. And the other is citizenship by investment. Remember, 5 out of the 6 independent states that are member in the Organization of East Caribbean States, OECS, have citizenship by investment program. They are St. Kitts and Nevis, that has been around for 35 years, Dominica, 25 years, and then St. Lucia, Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada. These programs are very important for the revenues of those countries. In Dominica, about half of the budget comes from CBI. And beyond these 5 countries, you have residency programs in Anguilla, in the Cayman Islands, and in the Bahamas. The programs, they vary greatly, both in terms of cost involved and in terms of procedure. Some countries you have to go there, others you never even need to set foot on the island to become a citizen. But what they have in common, they are of great importance to those countries. So let's look at what happened. On the demand side, there is a big upsurge. There is more people in this crisis who look for a plan B, who want to have a safe place for the next crisis to go, or who want to be able to travel once the crisis is over. So people who are normally busy, who are in their daily operations, who are stuck between airports, hotels, offices, conference rooms, etc., suddenly they cannot move, and they have time to think about what they want to do in the future, how they want to shape their lives, how they want to protect their families. You cannot choose where you are born, but you can choose where you live in and where you do business. So this is the time for them to think about those questions, particularly here in Southeast Asia. Singapore is a busy place. People don't sleep. Business never sleeps. It's 24/7. But now we had a circuit breaker here, so for 2 months, nothing moved, and people had time to think about it. And a lot of those Southeast Asian, Chinese, South Asian investors came to the conclusion they need a plan B, they need another passport, they need another residency to be able to escape those mega metropolis that are Jakarta, Manila, Mumbai, where you may not want to be in the next pandemic. You prefer to be on a beach in the Caribbean or in a house on a hill up there. So that's the demand side. That is up very clearly. More people come to the conclusion they need such solutions. And on the supply side, you have the Caribbean, especially the Eastern Caribbean. What have they done in this crisis? Each and every prime minister or foreign minister of those countries participated in several online webinars and roundtable discussions, something similar like we are having now, to promote their programs. Everything moved online. Before they traveled, they attend physically conferences in London, in Hong Kong, etc., in Singapore. Now it's online, and they take the time to be there and to make the point, to explain what are the advantages of the program, what are the specific advantages of their countries, and what are the changes. So we have seen quite a few changes in recent months to those programs. Generally, they have become more customer friendly to attract even more investors to the Caribbean, to either move there, to stay there, to live there physically, or to have a residency permit to be able to stay there, or to get the citizenship. So in St. Lucia, for example, that was the one that made the first move. In St. Lucia, the government has decided to add another option to the usual donation. So instead of just donating a 6-digit amount to the government, new citizens can decide to buy zero coupon government bonds for $250,000 with a duration of 7 years, or for $350,000 US for 5 years. That's revolutionary. That has not been there like this before. Before you had the donation option, and in other countries you had real estate option where you buy shares or units in approved developments, usually dedicated to tourism. Another first-timer is the price reduction that St. Kitts and Nevis offered, which said, okay, for families of 4, the donation amount goes down to 150,000. Fees remain there, of course. The due diligence is not changed, the procedure is not changed, but the donation amount is reduced. Other countries came with similar proposals. And all of them, they decided to accept applications initially online. So it doesn't mean everybody can upload his application documents and become a citizen. It's not that easy. you still need to go through an approved agent. You still need a licensed agent to submit your application. But the agent has the possibility, once documents are certified and scanned, but they may not be shipped physically, they may not be on a plane, they may not be DHL or FedEx or whatever, to upload the scans so that the due diligence process can start. And then later, of course, original documents are shifted over. But this is very important time-wise, so that due diligence process by dedicated firms can be processed, and applicants can be screened on their suitability, on their credibility, on their worthiness of becoming a citizen. So a great gain in efficiency on the side of the Caribbean countries. Similar news on the tourism side. In St. Vincent, for example, you had the announcement in the middle of the crisis, when almost no tourism came, that Sandals Resort, which is one of the biggest brand managers for hotels in the Caribbean region, is going to open a hotel there, and it will be the biggest in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So the crisis gives countries a chance to reflect on how they want to attract investment and with who they want to work and how they want to improve themselves and how they want to compete. The crisis is not the death of tourism. It gives it the pause, it gives it the rest, but it also gives it the chance to renew itself. And the same is for residence and citizenship by investment. The demand is there. The offers are there. The offers get better. So looking forward towards the end of the crisis, which in my opinion is not that far anymore. Now there is talk about vaccine and stuff. Travel has resumed in some areas. Here in Southeast Asia, we talk about green lanes between Singapore and China, between Singapore and Hong Kong, now with Malaysia. There is more to come like this. But looking forward towards the end of the crisis, you will have an increased demand for tourism. Obviously, people, they long for traveling. You will have better offers because the places have been cleaned up. Beaches are cleaner, water is cleaner, nobody has been there, or very few people. So something similar like in the Philippines with Boracay, it closed down for half a year and the mess was cleaned up and now it's paradise again. So something similar will happen to the entire region in the Caribbean. And something similar to the CBI industry. People will have made their choice. Some may have filed applications already, others may wait until things are back to normal to submit, but then you will have more demand and more interaction between the Asian region and the Caribbean, especially in those two fields. I hope this snapshot, this short insight on two important aspects of the Caribbean economy is helpful and inspiring, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Consul May. Very interesting insights on how residency by investment and citizenship by investment is playing a key role in the Eastern Caribbean, especially now. And one of the things that I read up recently is that, as you mentioned, Dominica, which is I'm also a citizen of, has used this program to increase their GDP, and it seems that many of the Eastern Caribbean countries that have these programs will heavily rely on the income for these programs. So we'll have more of that during our Q&A session, and I have a few questions about it, and we'll also find out how these help these small economies. So we'll just move forward with our final speaker for today. Let me just try to share my screen and showcase the remaining program. We have Dr. Thackwray Driver, the president of the Network of Caribbean Chambers of Commerce, who is also, if I'm not mistaken, the CEO of Energy Chamber in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm sure he will tell us more about that as he introduces himself officially. And of course, a little insight on the business climate in the Caribbean. So without further ado, Dr. Driver.
Well, thank you very much. And well, we're still in the morning here in the Caribbean, but so good morning to those in the Caribbean in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon to those in Europe, and good evening to those in Asia. I'm Dax Driver. As you can probably hear from my accent, originally British, but I've spent the last 25 years in Trinidad and Tobago, which is now very much my home. My connection with Southeast Asia is interesting. That I was a child. I grew up in Hong Kong as a child, and in those days, in the 1970s and early 1980s, when China was essentially closed off, our holidays were in Southeast Asia. So I have very fond memories of childhood family holidays in Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand and Singapore, and quite a few friends in Singapore as well. So I have very fond memories, but from a very long time ago. I am my substantive position is as the Chief Executive Officer of something called the Energy Chamber of Trinidad and Tobago. I've been doing that for the last 18 years. The Energy Chamber is the representative trade association for the oil, gas, and petrochemical sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Obviously, that is the major part of our economy here, and our job is to represent that industry in Trinidad. So increasingly, we're also moving into renewable energy as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So CARICHAM, I am the current president of CARICHAM for the next year. CARICHAM is a new organization, only a little bit over 1 year old. We are a network of chambers of commerce from across the Caribbean. So 22 chambers of commerce stretching from Bahamas in the north down to Suriname in the south, and Barbados in the east across to Belize in the west. So covering the English-speaking, the French-speaking, the Spanish, and the Dutch-speaking Caribbean. So really encompassing the entire region. We are a network, so we're not an association with a office or a secretariat. We are a network. Really essentially of the executive directors, the most senior staff members of those chambers. There's obviously a huge variety, a big variation in the sizes of those chambers, the sizes of those economies, and some big economies, including Cuba with a large population, Dominican Republic and Haiti, and then some countries with very small populations. And the chambers also vary a lot depending on the history between of the different islands and a different legal setup. But we are a network, and we communicate regularly. We're working on 4 pillars. We are working on, first of all, trying to really work around the disaster risk reduction area, which is obviously a major area for many economies within the Caribbean. We're then working on trade facilitation and regional integration. That's our second major pillar. Our third major pillar is we are working on trying to improve member offerings between our different chambers to make sure that we are sort of integrating those. That's very much a work in progress. The final area then is of sharing lessons learned, sharing best practices, and just communicating about how all of us run our associations in our respective countries. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the business climate in the Caribbean at the moment, and I think that the best word to describe it is stormy. It is a very stormy. We are in a very stormy situation with the pandemic, and we are also this time of year we're also facing storms as well. There's a depression in the northern Caribbean under. I think St. Kitts, Antigua are under storm watches, and Puerto Rico and the southern islands of the Bahamas are under tropical storm watch at the moment. So there's this ever-present issue around the hurricanes and their impacts on the region. And so that is why that is an issue which I think is very much on the top of everyone's mind. Climate change, I think the impact of climate change on the region is a big sort of longer term issue which we have to think about very carefully. So, but the business climate is very stormy. I mean, the economic outlook in the short term is very, very difficult. The tourism sector, I mean, obviously the two big industries of the Eastern Caribbean is the tourism sector, and then the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago. So I think we've heard quite a lot about the tourism sector, and because of the pandemics, we have had border closures and the tourism economy basically going to very close to zero across a lot of the countries in the region. That obviously has massive economic implications for all of those countries. In the energy sector, which dominates in Trinidad and Tobago, our major exports being natural gas, LNG, petrochemicals, particularly ammonia and methanol, and crude oil. Those are all obviously challenged as well. Low prices and some decreases in production. We have had production being shut in the country for both ammonia and methanol because of the low price environment. So both prices down and volumes down in terms of exports. So that's very, very challenging for us. I'll talk a little bit about Guyana and Suriname as well. I know that the concentration is mostly on the Eastern Caribbean, but Guyana and Suriname also been affected, obviously, by lower commodity prices. But in Guyana, that has been offset by this massive increase in oil production, which they are experiencing at the moment, and a lot more to come. So Guyana is the one country in the Caribbean which is projecting very, very strong economic growth, notwithstanding the lower oil prices and notwithstanding the political issues which they faced earlier this year. So Guyana is one place where we will expect to see very strong economic growth this year and into the next few years as well. Suriname has also had some large oil finds, and so we are expecting that not this year, but in the future, in the medium term, there's also a good potential for strong economic growth in Suriname. The one commodity which the region does produce, which has shown strong increases in price over the last year, is gold. Gold prices are up 30%. I think in these stormy times, people often go to these sort of safe commodities. So for Suriname and Guyana, both gold producers, that has been something which has given them a little bit of a reprieve from everything else. So we have this very stormy environment in the short term with the pandemic, and then hopefully we're going to move into recovery as the tourism product can pick up, and hopefully we'll see oil and gas prices and petrochemical prices increasing from the Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname perspective. Obviously low oil prices are actually useful for quite a lot of the importing countries within the region in the Eastern Caribbean who rely upon imported fossil fuels. But for Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, obviously increasing oil prices is good for us. So that's in the short term. We have this very stormy situation, and I think it's really just about trying to navigate the best for all of us as best we can through that unprecedented decrease in economic activity, and just trying to survive through that to come through hopefully into some calmer waters next year into 2021. But longer term, the region also has some very major challenges ahead of it. Climate change, I think, is a very major issue that the region has to grapple with. Obviously, small island states, sea level rise is a major issue that people will face. But also for the tourism product, the sentiment against air travel. We're not sure how air travel is going to pick up post-pandemic, and certainly particularly from Europe. You see the sentiment against long-distance flying, and that can have a negative, I think, potentially on the region as well. So those are things we have to be aware of for the tourism product and respond to it. Obviously, debt is a major issue for a lot of the economies within the region. The region is highly indebted, and our challenge is how do we earn the income to go on servicing that debt? And I think that is a big challenge for the region. The manufacturing is very challenging for most of the countries within the Caribbean. Very small domestic markets, very high cost of electricity, problems with port facilities for exporting, importing raw materials. The manufacturing is very difficult. Trinidad is perhaps a bit of an exception, that we do have some ability here with our manufacturing sector. and I think there's potential for growth in the manufacturing sector in Trinidad. We have a slightly larger market, but we also have lower cost energy, which also helps. And we do have some manufacturers here who have the ability to expand. But the challenge is what markets do they expand into, and how do they compete? So I think a lot of people, I think that the Caribbean market is such a small market that most of the manufacturers here are looking how do they expand outside of the Caribbean. Obviously, people putting an emphasis on Central America, economies like Colombia as well. So, but I think manufacturing has some potential from Trinidad, but for the rest of the region, I think it's very, very difficult. Tourism, I think, obviously is going to be an industry which continues to be of extreme importance. I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth in tourism post-pandemic. I think that the relatively good record within the region around dealing with the COVID crisis does create that opportunity to brand the region in terms of a healthy place to be, which we heard from the previous speaker. But I do think the region's going to have to spend a lot of time greening its tourism product. I think that people are looking for much greener tourism product generally. The region, I think, has some big advantages in that area which you can leverage, but it hasn't done so yet, really, to the full ability that it has. Financial services, we know the challenges there in the financial services sector with global regulation and the difficulty we have finding a way through those. But again, it's an area which I think there is potential. I do think we need to look generally to growth also outside those. We need to look at our other service areas. Given the challenges of manufacturing within the region, I think that services outside tourism, as well as areas where we need to look to growth, using the technology, using the ability to connect with the world. And the pandemic has forced us all to rethink that. So how do we use that? But as I think as the first speaker was showing, how do you actually monetize that, though? It's quite easy to connect with people, but how do you make money from doing that, to earn income for our economies? If I identify 4 sort of major opportunity areas, which I think that, which we're looking at in CARICHAM, and I think that a lot of companies around the Caribbean are looking at this as well. There's the opportunity area in terms of regional integration, that there are still very many trade barriers which exist crazily, but across the region there's still very many trade barriers and still a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. Just moving goods around the region still is not as easy as it should be. So we need to fix those things, work with the customs departments around the region, and really remove the non-tariff barriers which exist. Food, in particular, agricultural produce, faces many non-tariff barriers. We need to just fix those, because there's no reason why those should exist within the Caribbean. Free movement of people. We've made some movements to ease the movement of people around the region. So graduates and some people with skilled areas, but I think there's a big opportunity to further deepen the free movement of people for non-degreed skilled workers in particular. We need to put in place the measures to allow them to move. There is still work around the region which has to be done physically by people moving to different locations. Obviously, things like construction. You need to move people to be able to do those. And all the energy services, and there's a lot of opportunity in energy services. So the movement of people to support that is important. That is an ongoing discussion which we have with governments and with the CARICHAM Secretariat to try to make that happen. Financial service regulation, trying to remove the different regulatory environments which exist between different countries to try to make things easier for people to operate very easily. Pan-Caribbean, I think, is another area. So that whole area of regional integration, I think, is an opportunity area. Second one I'd identify is the diaspora. Obviously, there are many Caribbean people outside the Caribbean, particularly in North America, but all around the world. And how do we leverage that diaspora? It's something we always talk about within the region, and I think we have never really managed to make it work in any meaningful way. But I think perhaps the current crisis may make us rethink that. I've just noticed a lot more people reaching out to me during this current crisis from around the diaspora, Trinidadians all around the world, just to talk and looking for opportunities and thinking how that they can help through this situation. So we have this. I think there's been a tendency to think about the diaspora as a market, which I think there are challenges around reaching that as a market. But I think that we should also think about the diaspora as a supply of brain power. There's a lot of Caribbean people in very senior positions or extremely well qualified, all around the world. And how do we leverage that to create economic growth and find economic opportunities for the region? So that's the second area I'd identify. The third area, I think it's a big area for the Caribbean, is the whole area of art and culture. There's been a tendency, I think, to look just very much at Carnival and things around Carnival and bringing people to the region for Carnival, which obviously is a big part of the tourism product, and particularly here for Trinidad, but for other countries as well. I think we need to expand that and think more broadly about how we use the amazing sort of vibrant culture and art scene that we have developed both in the Caribbean and amongst the Caribbean diaspora in the rest of the world. Just think of Caribbean literature and how strong that is. And there's been a renaissance of Caribbean literature over the last few years, largely driven, I think, in part driven by the very successful Boca's Literary Festival, which we have in Trinidad every year, which has led this renaissance of Caribbean literature. I don't think it's been as strong as this since the 1960s or 1970s and that first wave. We need to look at things like that and take advantage of that. How do you take advantage of the very strong visual arts, fine arts scene which exists in a lot of Caribbean islands, and how do you use that to attract tourists, and how do you integrate that into our tourism product? So I think that there's a lot of potential in that art and cultural area. The final area I think there's a massive opportunity is in greening our economies. We need to really be much more dedicated and serious about how we're going to be much more energy efficient. A lot of the Caribbean is still relying upon importing fossil fuels to run its electricity sector. We need to really get those investments coming into geothermal energy, into solar, and into wind, reduce electricity costs. We need to integrate the electricity grids across the region, which allows you to bring on more renewable energy. That, I think, is a huge opportunity area. This is a region, so that the small islands, we should be setting ourselves the targets like Barbados has of going 100% renewable. I think that every island needs to sort of set that target, then figure out how we're going to do it. We'll need some integration between islands for that to happen, but I think it's a massive opportunity. It is probably, I can't think of anywhere in the world which is better suited to electric vehicles than the small islands of the Caribbean, because you never drive more than 100 kilometers in a day. So if we can bring renewable energy onto the grid, go fully electric in terms of our vehicle fleet, that would help develop our tourism product as well. So I think we should be really ambitious in how we're greening our economies. I think that's a massive opportunity area. And if we do that, I think that'll help the tourism product as well. So those are my four opportunity sort of areas: the integration, using the diaspora, art and culture, and greening our economies. And I think if we go after those are the things which long-term I think can help. I'm sure there's many others, but those are four I'm just offering now here for discussion purposes, to push the region to overcome the long-term challenges which we face. Because I think we can't underestimate how difficult those challenges are, not just in the short-term storm, but the longer-term issues for the region as well. So I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Driver, Dax. That was, interesting, especially when you mentioned about the four pillars that the CARICHAM itself is looking at this point. You also mentioned I think, some factors of the Caribbean single market and economy, especially when it comes to freedom movement of people and regional integration, trade integration, especially. That is something that we have also been supportive since day one at the Caribbean ASEAN Council, because we believe that, not just with CARICOM, but the whole region, whether it be the French-speaking, Dutch-speaking, or Spanish-speaking countries, could greatly benefit. One of the things that we would like to see down the road is exactly that. I mean, you'd think that with the islands being so close to each other, you would have that, and that is a massive opportunity sector that hopefully not just the Caribbean single market economy can handle, but the chamber, the CARICHAM itself can be part of. So we've come to a point where I would like to introduce. I hope Ria can come on board, Councillor Ria. But now I'd like to pass on the microphone to one of our councillors, Mr. John Robert Garay, who'll talk about himself briefly before his own reactions to everyone's presentation and statements. So, John Robert.
Hey everyone, I'm John Roper. So I've known Matthew since we were kids, right, from school, and we've read separate paths along the way, come together in the Caribbean. I've had over 20 years in the telecom and IT industries, and now back to IT industry as well, and the largest IT company. And all these discussions we've been having last few months are just very relevant, especially with how technology comes today. And I'm very, very glad to hear a lot of those insights and inputs from our friends who have been joining these discussions. And I'd be glad to, chime in during the question and answer. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, so thank you so much, John Robert. Do you have any reactions in the presentations for everyone, or any of the particular presentations that you can of our speakers that you would like to add on to, or have a reaction to? Your microphone is on mute.
Oh, was that from you or Ria?
No, that's for you. That's for you. Do you have any reactions to our speakers?
Yeah, well, the closest to my heart, of course, would be technology. Rasheed has presented a very comprehensive piece there about trends and issues on connectivity, access to internet, and it's been just a long journey for everyone around the world. Talking about how technology can level the playing field for everybody, not just within country economies, but globally. Right now, it's still the same issues that we're trying to address. I know of some countries outside of the Caribbean and ASEAN that are trying to bridge that gap through private efforts and not the usual internet connectivity layers, but there's a grand effort to bring access to those who live far from the cities, so that they can leverage on technology and make sure that more people can have access to information, which will be better quality of education as well. And at the same time, translate this into something that can livelihood. In places where there is a significantly higher technology adoption, we see that it works. A lot of these technological advancements create jobs, create livelihoods, create new streams of revenues for businesses, and new opportunities even for entrepreneurs to get into. And I think COVID kind of accelerated that, that appreciation of what technology has to offer. Though, in my personal opinion, it's so many years too late. But it is an opportunity for us. It is an opportunity for us to bridge that gap. So it is an opportunity for us to make sure that no one gets left behind. At least opportunities will be available to everyone who wants to be part of the economy. I'd leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you so much, John Robert. So I'm gonna try and throw questions to everybody as we move forward, especially with our speakers. Interesting things that you mentioned, Rashid, is that the digital economy right now, uh, especially in the graph that you showcased, where Zoom has essentially zoomed 129%. But of course, these are two different sectors. We're talking about the transportation industry that is always going to be a need um, after the pandemic or even during this pandemic. You know, there has been a drop in passengers basically for airlines, but there has also been an increase in logistics services in terms of flying things around products across regions across the world. So though there may be a drop in people flying, there has been an increase in objects flying, if there's a lack of a better word. So how do you see will that have an effect on the digital economy? Because right now, look, you know, education is geared towards what they call the digital economy. E-learning is become a growth sector all of a sudden. In your opinion, or how do you see this playing out down the road, or at least in the coming days?
Hmm, good question. So one thing I should point out firstly is that for a long time, at least for let's say 10 years or so, but maybe 20, but for a short 10 years, the valuation potential of companies, especially on the US markets, don't necessarily match the actual consumer sentiment or the actual real growth of the actual economy behind those companies. For example, the valuation of Zoom is obviously the expectation that investors have towards Zoom for the future. Now, the mere fact, however, that the investor expectation towards Zoom is extremely outstripping the actual investor expectation towards the actual airlines is that's a telling thing. Not the telling thing, but it's a telling thing. I think, for example, one of the big issues we're having is that although, as I mentioned in the presentation, although we've had so much growth in technology for consumer video conferencing and so forth, it hasn't actually translated to much. Because, for example, you still have your business trips, you still have your in-person conferences, you still have your seminars in the classroom at Harvard, etc., etc. So if, for example, this pandemic has unleashed a way for us to actually reorient our thinking towards how business communication, how business operation is done, then perhaps it's a good thing going forward. But the problem is that also, for example, in Japan, for example, even now, the current business culture is, even if you have, for example, a small supplier, you take your train down to Shinjuku and still have the actual in-person conversation. That kind of like it's almost like a caricature problem is actually there in Japan, but that caricature is still actually a big issue in general. So I think if, for example, that the investor expectation shot up Zoom so far, it could also be the case that corporations themselves actually are able to actually unlock their potential towards doing new orientation of business. For example, we see this massive movement for remote work now from big tech firms in the US. That will also require some new managerial expertise, some new managerial techniques, and hopefully then when those kind of solidify, they will get then translate again to developing countries. I think one thing people don't realize is that almost all, a significant proportion of corporate growth in developing world, like China, for example, didn't actually come from, let's say, innovation in techniques of new products and so forth. It actually came from managerial innovation. They took, for example, the managerial techniques of America and Japan and put it in China. That's actually what unlocked a lot of the growth. So if now we're having this expectation from investors towards Zoom and Zoom-like entities, you can probably have a good prospect for they're going to unlock more managerial expertise towards remote work and video conferencing. And that probably, to me, that's the telling example of that chart.
Thank you so much, Rasheed. Very insightful on that, and we look forward to the changes in the digital economy. Now, I'm going to go to you, Dr. Venkat. You did mention, of course, the elections, which is very vital during this pandemic. In my recollection, we've had, aside from Guyana, Suriname, Anguilla, the Dominican Republic, St. Kitts and Nevis, and of course Trinidad and Tobago, and of course Singapore for Southeast Asia. All during this pandemic, you know, not only is there a physical challenge in terms of the social risks, or sorry, I should say the health risk rather, of actually going to the precinct and all of that. So, what do you think is, and we have seen some drastic changes in some of these countries. For example, if I'm not mistaken, in the Dominican Republic, they elected a very young president. In Anguilla, a total opposite. You had a premier who was essentially a very senior official, well experienced, to somebody who was a former beauty queen, if I'm not mistaken. So hello, Ria. Welcome to our panel. These governance have extreme, and of course, you know, with St. Kitts and Nevis, you have a re-election as well. With Trinidad, the same officials were re-elected. So there is a challenge in terms of in governance during a pandemic. In your experience as an academician and you know, being able to correlate and correspond with some of these governments, what do you say? What can you say about the challenges that they will face, or is this a trend that we will see because of the electorate choosing the younger generation who will carry them over to beyond this pandemic?
Well, I'm not entirely sure whether that is likely to happen across the board. Now, of course, one of the things that is talked about a lot is the possible switch to electronic voting. It hasn't happened, at least it hasn't happened on a scale, and it'll take a while for that culture to change. But in terms of the dynamics of who stands for election, who is likely to win, I don't think it's possible now to make any judgments. And it's too soon anyway to discern any trends in that area. But there's one other aspect of elections which I think we need to be aware of, and that is what happens after the elections. And I'm not talking only about the kind of problems that we saw in Guyana, which was quite extreme. But it's possible actually to think about much less fractious disputes that arise after the elections. Now, the difficulty is most of the time these disputes are decided by the courts. Now, what if it's not possible to have access to the courts because of the pandemic, which is happening in a lot of countries? And there is a lot of dissatisfaction more generally about the fact that online hearings in courts are not quite the same thing as physical hearings, particularly because there is need for documents to be brought in for examination, cross-examination of witnesses, demeanor, etc., etc. So I can foresee a huge amount of problems in that area of what happens after an election. And also, of course, if a government or a political party or a politician refuses to honor the results of an election, what happens then? It's infinitely more difficult in those circumstances to resolve the dilemmas than it is when it's possible for people to move around freely.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Venkat. I'm just going to go ask both Dax and Consul May, because both of their countries just had their elections. I don't know if Consul May is still there. Consul May, if you can hear us. Uh, but Dax, so you've been living in Trinidad and for quite some time. So this is a re-election. How is the climate? When I mean climate, the electoral climate affected the pandemic? Has there been changes? Has that actually have they been has that trend? Similar trend that we would see in Guyana affected Trinidad, or
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not really a political commentator, so I'm always slightly nervous about talking about the politics too much of it. The turnout in Trinidad was down a little bit, not hugely, but the turnout was lower. And I think that the perception of that was because of fears about the pandemic. Trinidad's sort of trajectory in terms of COVID was we had an initial spike back in March, which was really people coming back into Trinidad, which was bringing some of the coronavirus in. We controlled it very well. We went down to a period from May through to towards the end of July when there were no cases in the country, and we had 0 cases of the coronavirus for really quite some time, and we opened up the economy during that time, and the elections were called during that time. As we moved into the last couple of weeks before the elections, we began to get some cases of coronavirus coming in. I think the consensus is that that probably came in from illegal immigration from Venezuela. This is something which you haven't really discussed yet on this call, but this is a big factor within the region, the situation in Venezuela. So we do have a lot of illegal migration coming into the country from Venezuela. The assumption is that somebody brought it in from Venezuela, where obviously the coronavirus is spreading very quickly. And then it got into the local population, and because we had all relaxed the controls, it got into a community spread situation. So the last 2 weeks here, we have quite strong spread of coronavirus. So that happening around the election time, I wouldn't say it was a huge election issue. I think that the government did, because it had done a really good job in the first place of controlling the coronavirus. I think that was something which they used in their sort of election campaign, and it gave some sense of competence, I guess, that they had managed to cope with the situation. I think there is a perception which a lot of people have. I don't know if epidemiologically it can really be proven yet, but there is a sense that the increased movement of people around elections, elections in Trinidad are very, as they are in a lot of Caribbean countries, there's a lot of it is face to face. People, politicians walking through communities, people hugging up and shaking hands. That may have contributed to the spread of the coronavirus as well. There's that perception. In any case, I would say the major issue, in Trinidad and in Guyana, which affects our elections, unlike quite a few of the countries within the Caribbean, is the ethnic conflict. And that's clearly a big feature, in Guyana, and a big feature in Trinidad, and to an extent in Suriname as well. So that is something which I think is a factor of the politics. And you do get sort of a heightened sense of ethnic competition during election seasons, which is unfortunate. I think this time around in Trinidad, the pandemic plus the Black Lives Matter movements coming in from in the US, I think was a factor in sort of how people interacted during the election period.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Dax. I'm just going to go introduce Ria, Dr. Prasad, who is one of our counselors engaged in climate change specifically. And Ria is now in the Netherlands. And before we move forward, like a congratulations, she just recently got engaged. So congratulations, Ria. This pandemic, of course, like in the Caribbean and also in Southeast Asia, it is hurricane season in the Caribbean and also tropical cyclone season in Southeast Asia. And as that happens, as the weather changes, we're still engaged pretty much in the pandemic. How do you look? How does climate change affect things moving forward in the pandemic, in terms not necessarily in the scientific sense, but in a general sense? Has that made them changes? Has that affected how we look forward to making things change in climate?
I think that what COVID-19 and climate change both have in common in terms of their effect on us is that they have huge economic impacts. And so this year is actually a much more aggressive hurricane or typhoon season than what we historically see. And we're seeing that also coming through in the Caribbean and into North America, but also in the South Pacific. And so it just kind of compounds the issues of, what are we going to do in terms of our economics, in terms of our quality of life, in terms of our adaptation. Both COVID-19 and also our climate situation, the crises that are that these things impose upon the population are such that people have to right now adapt to change. And that's actually the critical ability right now. Change management is going to mean being open and flexible to new business models, new business ideas, adapting to the current market and its changes and to shifts across the board. And so what we're seeing here is that both with whether it's with COVID or with climate, everyone is having to make changes. Everyone is going to have to adapt to that. And in order to do that, it's going to require a lot of creativity and flexibility, but also positivity, because it can be very depressing, both on a collective and a business-wide level, but also on an individual level. So what we're seeing, whether it's through COVID, but then also through the climate situation and the increasing typhoons and the hurricanes that are happening, so we're seeing institutions, major institutions, having to basically turn the Titanic. It's like completely turning a ship, so to speak, whether it's in the media industry, the banking industry, supply chain. The entire employment landscape is changing, is what we're seeing. We're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that globally as well. And so I think what really needs to happen is that we have to accept change. We have to continue to move forward and push on and be very solution minded. That's really what this is requiring, that we can't just do everything the same, whether it's with COVID or with climate. We have to put all of these things into our problem solving, capabilities to figure out what we're going to do and to navigate through these waters. And so we have to think of really out of the traditional box. And what I think is that digitalization and technology, this will help us in a new paradigm of automation. But with it, it also comes the need for leaner and more adaptable business processes, also a workforce that can pivot their skills quickly to adapt to these kinds of crises, whether it's the climate crises or the coronavirus crisis. It also means being willing to learn new skills. People, I think, will have to retrain or work in other fields, maybe that they're not always accustomed to. But the quicker that we can adapt to change, the better off we'll be. So all of these things, whether it's with climate or with COVID, is shaking up the status quo. And so we're just going to have to be really good problem solvers and just really flexible during these times.
Thank you so much, Ria. That's interesting that you mentioned change. I think that's one of the major things, positive things, if you want to put it that way, positive things that this pandemic has given us. For many people, we don't like change, but it has effectively been forced upon us. Well, it's now how you react to that change that will make you succeed or feel defeated about what has been happening. Okay, I think we just lost Consul May, so I'm just gonna go ask everyone for just a quick final words of reactions to how you are where you are. When I say how you are in terms of the pandemic, we'll just go back to Ria. Ria is in the Netherlands, and she's been there, and she herself has experienced some. Before that, she was diagnosed with not the pandemic, the COVID-19, but obviously it was when she later found out, and that was months ago. She's obviously very well now. How has the pandemic? You mentioned during our last roundtable discussion last month that Netherlands was, well, everyone's just cocky. Everything's fine. It's been a month on. How are things in your part of the world?
I think everyone is struggling with the balance between trying to live their lives and not be completely paralyzed, but then also trying to have a modicum of safety. And so it's been, each person has to make that judgment and that determination. And a lot of people, they don't want to be completely paralyzed. They want to go to a restaurant, or they want to, go to a store or something like that. And it's a very tricky balance. I think the whole world is trying to figure out what is that balance between people having, that element of freedom and not completely shutting down the economy, but then also people staying safe with reasonable risk levels. And I think that that's not worked out not in this country. And I know it's not worked out in the US where I'm from. And so, doing a lot of work over there. And so I think it's just a real dilemma. It's a real dilemma for everyone. But at the end of the day, we each have to take a personal responsibility. What is my own risk level? Like, do I want to go to the gym, or do I want to go to that restaurant when I see that it's so crowded? And for myself, I'm staying away from the crowded spaces, and I'll go places, but I have to exercise real caution when I get out there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ria. John Robert, I know you were supposed to fly out of the Philippines. You should be in the U.S. sometime about this time. It was your original plan, as what we were just talking about. So, how has that affected your personal few months since we last discussed?
Yeah, actually, Matt, I was supposed to fly out in March, just before they announced that there's going to be a lockdown, and then I was monitoring how things were over in Texas, and it looked like there was going to be a surge there, so I had to cancel. I guess just like what we discussed the last time, nobody really thought that it would last this long. In the Philippines, it's on the upside, there are more testing that's being done. I think in this month, it's been total tests, unique tests have reached more than 2 million already. But that acceleration came in a few months, after the lockdown, and probably around 7 months after the first case was detected in the Philippines. There was a study recently, just this week, that was released just this week, saying that possibly the infections could have reached about 2.9 million Filipinos way back in April. And that those were not detected primarily because there were not many testing that was being conducted. There was no mass testing at the time. I've heard from friends in both in government and the private sector who are involved in a lot of these activities. There are varying challenges to why mass testing was not done. But now that there is that, so to speak, the ball is rolling when it comes to testing, so to speak. I guess that what's really critical right now would be how to be more effective in terms of testing, tracing, and then treating people. I personally know of a few people who died of COVID, and these were healthy folks, in their 40s, early 40s, and with healthy lifestyles, and they were not, they were very careful about the way they interact in the public or attend to any public gathering, even out. Still, they got infected. So you can't say, but I got the chance to move around a few months ago due to a personal emergency. But along the way, I've seen that, I guess Rio was right to point out that it may have to boil down into how we make ourselves personally responsible to how we act, how we conduct ourselves in the midst of this pandemic. It's varying. There are varying reactions and behaviors and practices among people I've met along the way, along the routes I took. I've got people who, just because they're far from, let's say, capital, they think that the virus can't really be there. And there are those, even those governments who think that the best way for them to manage this situation is by blocking any test results that would show that they have a positive case, even if it's a mild case. So it's crazy how different people react to it, but it's also scary because the more that people would be not conscious about how they would behave and how they would look at the situation, the most vulnerable in the population could be at risk because of that. You can see how even the national government is having a difficult time trying to get the practices or the protocols implemented at the local level. For various reasons, it could be familiarity with these health protocols, cultural biases, perhaps as well. Thinking that these are first world issues and not really issues that they can relate to. So they treat it differently. But I guess what is going to be critical for everybody, not just the Philippines, but the world, will be how we move forward from here. It may mean that we have to relook at density, population density management. We know that there are centralized opportunities are kind of centralized in some select urban centers in each country, but this could change too with this pandemic. We're seeing it in education, we're seeing it in business, and so I think we just have to embrace that we have to adapt and move forward. As humans, we have done this many times in the past, but this time around, I guess we just have to do it sooner and be more inclusive about it. Get as many people as possible involved, and not have anybody left behind. Because that's the only way for the world to move forward as well economically. Truly, I think that would be in our best interest as people. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much, John Robert. And just briefly from Dr. Venkat, how was Northern Ireland's experience in this pandemic?
Well, without being complacent, I think it's fair to say that Northern Ireland has been relatively insulated from the worst effects of the pandemic. Actually, oddly enough, we don't have statistical information of the kind that we get for the rest of the country, that is to say, England or Scotland. And I don't know why that is, but at least I haven't seen a lot of regular reports about the number of cases, number of deaths, etc. But just anecdotally, looking around me, I see that life is nearly back to normal. I live out in the country, about 20 miles away from the capital city, Belfast. But I do go to Belfast from time to time. And as I said, we have reached a state of near normality. Although, of course, it's difficult to tell whether there's going to be a second wave, about which there is some talk. In some respects, actually, Northern Ireland is a bit like one of the smaller Caribbean islands. We are sort of cut off from the mainland. And so, as I said, overall, we are doing well, but it's impossible to tell what's going to happen in the near future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Venkat. And Rasheed, from our last conversation, you said that you mentioned that Barbados was having its own set of challenges in this pandemic. How has that improved so far?
So, just to went back. So, but in terms of actual health problems, Barbados has done pretty well. Again, because it's a small, fairly isolated, turn the echo, small, fairly isolated country, you don't actually have a massive increase in cases. So I think, for example, we right now for many days we have 0 cases, and the only cases we actually do have are, for example, cases that were actually were like foreign guests that came into Barbados. But of course, that's fine. Just isolate for a while, and after you're much better, then you can come back into the actual population. So we've had actually zero community infections for quite some time. So in terms of normality, Barbados is, I would say, 98% back to normal. The only issue is obviously when you're going out, must wear the mask and so forth. Restaurants are open, bars are open, gyms are open, public transportation is fine. So, and obviously that's good because also now it's a good thing to attract people who actually are, in their hometowns and they want to kind of get some more freedom. Now, however, the actual downside is that because, for example, Barbados is based primarily on tourism services, the economy-wise, that has had a huge impact. So I think, I could be wrong, but I think the last data was that the unemployment rate was like 30-some%. I think now. Also extraordinarily high. And also because also the tourism industry, I think accounted for I think maybe 30-some% of GDP, or directly 17%, indirectly 30-some%. So it's quite heavily in tourism skewed. So because of that problem, obviously, people aren't traveling, hotels aren't open, so forth. That's been a huge impact. So it's going to be a quite tricky thing to see the government to actually reorient the economy to have a system where you're not so dependent on tourism. But of course, that's a very, very slow cruise ship turning type endeavor. You can't wake up one morning, have new policy and say, okay, problem solved. So they started these new policies like have this welcome stamp where you can apply for this new visa and come to live in Barbados for 12 months straight as a tourist. You don't pay income tax in Barbados under that stamp. So they're trying this new policy step by step to kind of figure out how do we actually kind of, create a more anti-fragile system, given that you can't just rely on these tourism markets forever. This was a problem for many, many years, but now obviously because that's a supply shock, the government now putting much more effort into it. But besides that, in terms of normality, like life as usual, it's pretty normal.
Thank you so much, Rasheed. And for the final set of comments on you, Dr. Tax, you mentioned already the situation in Trinidad and Tobago. Let's talk about the business sector as a whole in the Caribbean, looking towards the pandemic now and 1 year from now. Briefly, what can you, without really just looking at the foresight?
Well, I think it's been a survival situation. It's basically been, and everyone's tried to as best they can just survive the current crisis. Then I think that in the longer term, I think people are looking at what are the opportunities with the tourism sector coming back, hopefully with growth, particularly in Guyana. There's a lot of people who are looking at that as a potential area for some economic activity. But I think people remain very cautious, very uncertain. It's very difficult making forward plans in this situation. So this is where then nimbleness and flexibility comes in. And I think that's people are trying to get their head around that, and how do you make sure you're nimble and flexible and don't have 5-year plans which you're going to execute because you just don't know how things are going to roll.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll just say my final words. I'd like to thank everyone for their time. Ria, Rasheed, Dr. Venkat, Dax, John Robert, and of course Consul May, who we understand is already on his way home. It is almost midnight in Southeast Asia, so it's understandable that he would have logged out quite early. It is a challenge for both regions. One of the things that we are trying to bridge for the Caribbean ASEAN Council is, of course, the bilateral relations to both regions. And I think one of the John Robert mentioned the challenges the Philippines was encountering in terms of mass testing, the rising numbers of COVID cases. But if we are looking at it as a regional perspective, Southeast Asia's numbers are pretty low. In many countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, or Cambodia, they have essentially, are not even comparable to the numbers in their population. It seems that Southeast Asia and the Caribbean will have that opportunity to be out of the woods, so to speak, earlier than the rest of the world. In my opinion. Of course, that is in terms of the pandemic. Now, economy-wise, it's another story altogether. Economies in Southeast Asia heavily rely on sending money from abroad, from their citizens. Manufacturers in other countries are also down. Caribbean tourism is very much at a pause. How long will that pause be? No one knows. So it is a point that both regions can actually consider working together, showcasing best practices, and comparing notes on how things should move forward. So on that note, I'd like to thank again everyone for being part of this discussion for this month's Caribbean Southeast Asia, and thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you face to face in the future. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and good morning from me here in Vancouver. And please keep safe to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.